If you were to put a gun to my head and forced me to choose, I'd probably say that games in the vein of BioShock, Portal, and Shadow of the Colossus are my personal favorites, narratively driven yet mechanically sound experiences. As striking that balance is no easy task, however, I've come not to expect them, least of all from studios with limited budgets. That being said, there are certainly exceptions, and based on my initial impression of it after playing an early build, that's exactly what I was expecting color-based puzzle game She Remembered Caterpillars to be, an anomalously well-rounded indie title. I now realize that I somewhat misjudged the game's strengths in this regard, but one thing remains certain. It deserves a lot more attention than it's received up to this point, and I'm going to try and tell you why. SRC appears very unassuming at first, which I suspect is why it was all but tucked away and abandoned in a small part of the indie section when I played it at Gamescom last year, despite the fact that the lines for almost anything else were close to endless. However, while undoubtedly a little rough and unpolished in places, the game's hand-drawn style and vibrant color palette allowed that cursory assessment to fade very quickly. I should note that I continued to be mildly put off by some of the animation in the game, which seems to be missing frames at times, though I certainly make room for the possibility that this is simply an artistic choice that didn't quite land with me and not a cost-cutting measure. The game's music is actually just as unintrusive as its visual presentation, and yet it does a commendable job guiding its tone chapter by chapter, shifting between various flavors of serenity and distress throughout. It may not sound like much if listened to on its own, but that's not necessarily the measure of a good soundtrack. What it lacks in broad appeal it makes up for by complementing the game's visuals about as well as it could have. The overwhelming feeling I got from this game is that it's not meant to be a feast for the senses so much as a largely tranquil mind teaser, and for that purpose it makes a great deal of sense to have sound and visual designs that allow for the puzzles to take center stage. The game takes an unconventional approach to storytelling, which is to say, there isn't a story in the traditional sense. If you're anything like me, you immediately wonder who the titular she is, and why she's remembering caterpillars of all things. The thing is, those questions remain materially unanswered by the end of the game. As it is, even calling her the game's protagonist feels slightly disingenuous, given how much she feels like a nondescript stand-in for the player. Any attempts to see her as more than that begin and end with a number of brief textual interludes between stages, which themselves only provide scant details and fail to divulge so much as the names or appearances of the people involved. Virtually the only characteristics of hers that I can discern are that she's dealing with the loss of a loved one, and I suppose that she's female. In short, the game provides the vague outlines of a plot and character arcs, but refuses to clue us into any of the details. In cases where this is done with enough environmental tells to infer a greater story, I think it's actually an engaging, if less accessible way to give the player agency to come up with their own interpretations of what they're seeing. The problem with SRC arises once you realize that there isn't enough information to make any such inference, since the few intersections that exist between the story and the game at large are of an equally obfuscating nature as the text itself. The progressively changing coloring and imagery in the levels in particular stuck out to me as intended to illustrate the protagonist's various stages of mourning in some way. However, I would argue that viewing the issue through that abstract lens is by itself a distancing exercise, making the game read more like an analytical paper than a poignant tale of loss and acceptance. As mentioned earlier, the music did successfully indicate to me a kind of emotional atmosphere at any given moment, but I do wish the game had done more to contextualize why it wanted me to feel that way. SRC is a game about grief to about the same extent that Mario is a game about romance. In both cases, the theme exists in the respective game's periphery, but it's never dealt with directly enough for the player to develop any meaningful investment. The main difference between the two being that, while Mario is very upfront about how ambitious and irrelevant its story actually is, SRC markets itself as an exploration of a serious issue that it ultimately fails to deliver on. While I certainly don't mean to typecast games into a specific manner of telling stories, or to discourage discussions about complex and off-the-shoot topics like loss and pain, I think SRC, in its attempt to be a tone piece, ultimately falls short of the artistic conceit it's going for, leaving behind any emotional resonance it might have had along the way. What the game ironically does manage to elicit some quiet introspection, however, is in its mechanics. Arguably the most direct indication of how challenging the problem-solving in a game is the extent to which it takes place in the player's head. Chess is considered by many to be the quintessence of this idea, and although SRC's systems rely on color theory and not military strategy, I think the comparison stands as the two are not dissimilarly challenging, and people who like one will probably find the other just as thoroughly enjoyable. SRC's mechanical premise is very simple. consisting mainly of a set number of colored game pieces and a corresponding number of exits for them to take. The game then modulates difficulty by constantly placing more and more obstacles in your way, such as bridges only pieces of a certain color can cross, or gates only ones of a certain color can't cross, etc. Your main tool in overcoming these obstacles is splitting and merging the pieces to create the desired color. It's easy enough to grasp, but given some smart level design, you can probably already start to see how this could get exceedingly complicated very quickly. And it does. Since there is no immediate way to tell which exit each piece has to take, you're left to figure it out on your own, usually requiring you to work backwards from where you want them to end up and plan out your moves in advance. In this way, the game becomes a genuinely compelling test of your deductive reasoning and lateral thinking skills, followed by a certain rush of accomplishment when you beat an especially intricate level that makes you feel not unlike a Grandmaster chess player, if only for a moment. There's really no point in me dwelling on this any longer. The puzzling in this game is about as pure a logical challenge as you'll find. It's not enthralling in the same way that a great story can be, but to my mind, it's no less so. I hesitate to call the game ludonarratively dissonant, since that would erroneously imply that the mechanics and story are at odds with each other, so instead I'll go with detached or distant. So distant, in fact, that it had me reaching for interpretations that would have allowed me to reconcile the two. But if there is any obvious connection between moving bug-shaped game pieces around on a board and processing the death of a loved one, I have yet to find it, and a vague sense of sorrow does not, by itself, a moving story make. My enjoyment of the game never seemed to hinge on the success of the story, though, and neither does my overall recommendation. As much as I have admonished SRC's story, and I think I should given how much the game is ostensibly built around it, its worst offense is arguably distracting the player from the game's excellent mechanical core and having no incisive message to show for it. My guess would be that that's a flaw a sizable subset of people likely won't take issue with. She Remembered Caterpillars, at least as far as its mechanics are concerned, is a highly capable first foray into game development by studio Jumpsuit Entertainment, and in my humble opinion is very much worth the price of admission. Very briefly before I close out the video, I'd like to thank the almost 50 of you that are now subscribed to the channel. You are amazing. Thanks for sticking around, first of all, despite how sporadically I've been uploading videos. I tend not to be very loquacious about the things I'm working on. I'll try to be better about that going forward. For now, rest assured that I'm definitely not short on ideas. As always, comments and ratings, both positive and constructively critical, are very welcome if you're so inclined. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.